It was supposed to be just another routine morning until it turned into a national reckoning. At 8:05 a.m., Margaret Ellison stepped out of her silver Buick and began climbing the steps of the Charleston Federal Courthouse. The sun filtered through the Spanish moss hanging from the ancient trees, casting long shadows across the granite stairs. Clad in a crisp navy blue blazer and heels that echoed quietly with each step, Margaret looked every bit the dignified professional she was. A leather folio in hand, she adjusted her collar and moved with the calm precision of someone who belonged there. But this morning, no one saw her authority. No one saw the federal judge. All they saw was a black woman walking alone. At the main checkpoint, Deputy Frank Dillard eyed her with suspicion. He didn't ask for her name, didn't offer a greeting, just raised his gloved hand and ordered her out of line. Margaret's calm inquiry was met with indifference, and even when she presented her federal ID. Frank barely glanced at it before slipping it into his pocket like it meant nothing. She asked for it back. He smirked. From that moment on, everything shifted. Margaret had entered the courthouse to uphold justice, but before she could reach the courtroom, she would be humiliated, violated, and silenced by the very people sworn to protect the law. What they didn't know, though, was that the woman they were mistreating wasn't just a visitor. She was the judge. And in a few minutes, everything would change. Deputy Frank Dillard didn't hesitate. Gripping Margaret Ellison's arm with unnecessary force, he steered her away from the main security lane and down a side hallway. The cool fluorescent lights flickered slightly overhead, casting long, sterile shadows as they entered a small, windowless screening room. The door clicked shut behind them. Inside, the space was clinical and cold, bare walls, a single metal chair, and a cart of outdated screening equipment in the corner. But what drew Margaret's eyes immediately was the pair of electric clippers sitting ominously on a tray. Her stomach twisted. "I do not consent to this," Margaret said, her voice calm but firm. "There is no legal justification for detaining me. You're violating protocol." Frank shrugged, motioning toward the chair. "That's funny. You're acting suspicious enough to warrant extra measures. Could be hiding something in that hair of yours." Margaret stiffened. "Excuse me, you heard me," he said, voice gruff with a mocking edge. "Sit down, now." Before she could respond, two more officers entered the room. One, a younger man with a shaved head and nervous eyes, grabbed her left wrist. The other braced her shoulder. She didn't struggle, she didn't need to. Her words were her resistance. "This is illegal," she said, raising her voice as much as her dignity would allow. "Give me your names. This is a violation of my civil rights." No one answered. Frank reached for the clippers and flicked the switch. The buzzing sound filled the room like a swarm of bees. Margaret felt a sharp tug as the cold metal touched her scalp. A thick silver coil of hair dropped to the floor. Then another, and another. She sat rigid, her fists clenched in her lap, her breath shallow but steady. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. Not one tear. Each strand that fell was a piece of her past years of care-pride history, now scattered like trash on the tiled floor. "She looks better already," one officer muttered under his breath. "Should have come in here with some respect," Frank added, brushing stray hairs off his sleeve. But Margaret didn't flinch, not even when the clippers stopped, not even when Frank leaned in sneering, "You're free to go." Courtrooms down the hall. She rose slow and composed, reclaiming her badge from his desk without asking. Her fingers trembled, but her gaze didn't waver. They had stripped her hair, but they hadn't touched her resolve. Because in just a few minutes, she wasn't going to be in that hallway anymore. She was going to take the bench. And then the reckoning would begin. Margaret Ellison walked the corridor like a woman reborn, not in peace, but in purpose. Each step toward the courtroom was heavy, her scalp tingling where her silver hair had once proudly curled. That hair had taken years to grow, years of love from her grandmother's hands, years of pride in her heritage. And now, uneven tufts were all that remained, a raw symbol of what had been taken. Yet she didn't cover it. She didn't flinch. Instead, she passed staff and clerks who avoided her eyes, who clearly knew something had happened, but chose silence over courage. She gave them nothing in return. Not a word. Not a tear. Only steps, slow, deliberate, echoing like a countdown. Down the hall, murmurs filtered from the double doors of the main courtroom. Inside was a packed gallery. A high-profile case was about to begin. One involving police misconduct during a protest, an incident that had already drawn national attention. Reporters lined the back row. Civil rights attorneys, journalists, and community leaders had all gathered, expecting a routine hearing. They had no idea what was coming. Margaret was supposed to enter from her private chambers, where her robe had been neatly laid out, and staff waited to usher her in with ceremonial decorum. But today she had no interest in ceremony. She didn't want robes or pageantry. She wanted truth. She wanted accountability. And she wanted every single person in that courtroom to see what had been done to her before she ever said a word. She paused for only a breath at the doors. Then she pushed them open with both hands. The room stilled. Conversations died mid-sentence. Heads turned, and gasps rippled like wind through dry grass. There she stood, bare scalp exposed, her heels clicking against the marble like gunfire in a silent square. No one said a word. Margaret walked past rows of spectators, past prosecutors and defense attorneys, past the very police officers now on trial. Some stared with confusion, others with disbelief, a few with guilt. And then the realization spread like wildfire who she was, the woman who had been led through the halls like a suspect. The woman who had been violated just moments earlier was not a victim. She was the judge. Margaret stepped behind the bench, never breaking eye contact with the stunned bailiff. Frank Dillard himself still stationed by the side door. His face drained of color. She didn't speak to him. She didn't need to. She reached for her robe and slipped it on with the precision of someone donning armor. Then she faced the courtroom and spoke the words that shifted the ground beneath everyone's feet. The court is now in session. The weight of Margaret Ellison's voice echoed across the marble courtroom like thunder over a still lake. The court is now in session, she had said, and yet everyone in that room knew something deeper had just been declared. Order wasn't being restored, it was being redefined. The attorneys stirred in their chairs, some visibly shaken, others silently reckoning with what they had just witnessed. But Margaret's gaze never flickered. Her tone remained even as she called the first witness in a case already steeped in controversia, protest turned assault involving Charleston police. A veteran had been injured. Trust had been broken. And now, with Margaret at the helm, the very system that had protected abusers for years was about to be put on trial. She sat still through the first two testimonies, listening with an intensity that made the room feel smaller. Her pen moved sparingly. She asked no questions, but she was watching everyone, especially the man lingering by the rear wall, shifting from foot to foot, hands twitching at his belt. Deputy Frank Dillard. He looked like he wanted to disappear. And then she said it. Court is in recess. People stood. Papers rustled. Voices dropped to whispers, as if everyone were afraid to speak too loudly in her presence now. Margaret remained seated, unmoving, until nearly everyone had exited the chamber save for her clerk, 2 officers, and Dillard himself. She waited another beat, then turned her voice a blade. "Deputy Dillard, step forward." He froze, eyes wide, mouth opening and closing without sound. She didn't flinch. State your full name for the record. O. Frank Dillard, Mom, Your Honor. How long have you served as a bailiff in this courthouse? She asked, her voice like ice sliding across glass. 14 years, he croaked. She tapped her pen once, then again. And in those 14 years, how many women have you assaulted in that screening room? The blood drained from his face. 2 didn't know. That's not what I asked. Silence. His jaw worked, but no answer came. Deputy Dillard, Margaret said, leaning slightly forward. You didn't know who I was. You didn't care to ask. You saw a black woman walking into this building and assumed she was no one. So you laid hands on her. You humiliated her. You shaved her head. For sport. He tried to speak, but his voice was lost. Margaret stood slowly, her robe flowing around her like a judge rising from battle. You assaulted a federal judge in her own courthouse, and now you are the subject of a criminal investigation. She turned to the officers standing by the door. Escort Deputy Dillard into custody. Separate holding. Formal charges to follow. The click of handcuffs rang out like the verdict itself, and as he was led away, the courtroom, once his domain, no longer recognized him. He was just another man who thought his badge made him untouchable. And now he would find out what justice really looked like. The courtroom had never been quieter than it was in the minutes after Deputy Frank Dillard was escorted away in handcuffs. His absence left a gaping silence, a void that wasn't just physical, but historical. For years he had stood by those doors, intimidating, mocking, violating with impunity. Now he was gone, and the air felt different, lighter in some ways, heavier in others. Judge Margaret Ellison sat behind the bench, her robe now settled over her shoulders like armor forged by fire. Her face remained calm, but her eyes burned with a quiet fury. The next witness was already being prepped, but Margaret allowed herself a brief moment to look out over the gallery. Though the room had refilled, it was not the same courtroom anymore. When the clerk called for the next witness, a tall, weathered man in his mid-40s stepped up. His name was Howard Briggs, a warehouse foreman with the hands of a man who had spent a lifetime in labor and the eyes of a father who had watched helplessly as his child suffered. He was there to tell the story of what had happened to his son. Years-old, soft-spoken honors student tackled by officers during a peaceful protest. The teen had done nothing but hold a sign and raise his voice. For that, he was thrown to the ground, his windpipe crushed under a knee. He survived, but could barely speak above a whisper 9 months later. As Mr. Briggs testified, the courtroom hung on every word. His voice trembled, at times cracked under the weight of memory, but never wavered in purpose. He spoke of begging officers to call paramedics, of being told "He's fine." He's faking it. He spoke of the footage that emerged weeks later and how none of the officers involved had been disciplined. Margaret didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. Every word he spoke was a blade cutting through decades of silence. His testimony wasn't just about his son. It was about every voice that had been ignored, every plea that had been dismissed, every truth that had been buried beneath the marble floors of that courthouse. When he finished, he looked at Judge Ellison with eyes full of pain and quiet resolve. "I just want to know it meant something," he said, "that somebody finally listened." Margaret didn't answer as a judge. She answered as a human being. "You've been heard, Mr. Briggs." And in that moment, the silence in the room didn't feel like fear anymore. It felt like reckoning. After Howard Briggs stepped down from the witness stand, the courtroom remained hushed, as though everyone needed time to absorb what had just been said. Judge Margaret Ellison sat still behind the bench, her fingers interlaced in front of her eyes, steady gaze, unwavering. She had heard stories like Mr. Briggs before, in whispers in sealed files in complaint forms, that never made it past a desk drawer. But hearing it spoken aloud under oath in this very courtroom, this was different. And it was far from over. Within moments, the door to her chambers creaked open, and her clerk entered with a sealed envelope from the Department of Justice. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly as she broke the seal and read its contents. It was official. A federal investigation had been launched, not just into Frank Dillard, but into the entire Charleston courthouse staff. Every complaint buried, every report ignored, every silence enforced. The knock on the chamber door that followed came not from an officer, but from Reverend Marcus Hill, a man Margaret hadn't seen in nearly a decade. His gray beard had grown thicker, his posture slower, but his presence remained unshaken. He handed her a folded list full of names, notes, phone numbers, each one. A person who had once walked through the courthouse and left without justice. Some of these people, he said quietly, they were hurt by Dillard. Others by folks like him. But they're ready now. They'll talk. If you want the truth, they've got it. Margaret opened the list slowly, her eyes scanning the pages. There were more names than she expected. Most of them she didn't recognize, but a few she did. And that made her heart tighten. These weren't just anonymous complaints, they were people she had unknowingly passed in the hallways. People who had been brutalized while she sat behind the bench trusting the system to do its job. She looked up at Reverend Hill and said softly, "They were told it wasn't worth it." He nodded. "But they were wrong. It is now. Because of you." When he left, Margaret sat back down at her desk and stared at her own reflection in the mirror above the wash basin. Her uneven scalp was a stark reminder of what had happened, but it was also a signal of what had been exposed. This wasn't just about one officer. It was about an entire machine built to protect power, even when that power abused the people it claimed to serve. The real trial had just begun, and she wasn't backing down. By the time the courtroom reopened after recess, word of what was unfolding inside had begun to spread far beyond the walls of the Charleston courthouse. Outside, protesters gathered on the steps, their signs rising like sails against the wind. "Justice starts now, protect black women," and 12 complaints. Zero accountability. Inside, Judge Margaret Ellison took her seat once again, not behind a veil of decorum, but with the unshakable presence of a woman who had survived an assault and returned to lead a reckoning. The next witness called to the stand was Denise Talley, a former records supervisor at the courthouse. Neatly dressed in a tailored suit, glasses perched low on her nose, Denise was known for being quiet, efficient, and never causing waves. But today she was not here to be quiet. She was here to speak the truth. Under oath, Denise recounted her years working in the courthouse's records department. She explained how she had seen dozens of complaints filed against Deputy Dillard, some formal, others whispered, but watched as each one either disappeared or was marked resolved without action. 12 official complaints, she said, her voice trembling at first, then strengthening with every word. At least twice as many informal ones, and they were buried. On purpose. The courtroom buzzed, and Margaret leaned in, her voice sharp and direct. "Who buried them, Ms. Talley?" Denise hesitated, glancing once toward the back of the room, where a portrait of a retired judge still hung on the wall. Then she said the name Judge Terrence Mahoney. A low gasp rippled through the gallery. Mahoney had once been a pillar of integrity in the courthouse, Margaret's own mentor. But now his legacy was cracking like old stone. Denise continued, "He said if we investigated Dillard, it would undermine public trust, that it would make the courthouse look weak." Margaret froze at those words. She had heard that exact phrase before. Make us look weak. Not justice. Not truth image. She scanned the courtroom. The realization hit like a cold wave. This wasn't just a rogue officer's sins. This was a culture of silence, of complicity. More hands began to rise in the gallery. People who had sat quiet for years. One by one, voices emerged. A man named Lewis Bryant stood and said, "Dillard broke my ribs in 2011. I filed a complaint. They said I tripped and fell. 5, 10, 15 others followed their stories, pouring into the courtroom like water breaking through a dam." Margaret didn't smile. She didn't cry. She simply listened, because for the first time in years, the courthouse wasn't protecting power. It was hearing the people. And that changed everything. As the final witness stepped down, the rain outside intensified, battering the courthouse windows like a warning from nature itself. Inside the gallery remained packed, not with just legal observers, but with ordinary people, teachers, veterans, students, mothers, drawn not by spectacle, but by something deeper. Change. Judge Margaret Ellison remained seated at the bench, her face solemn, her hands resting on a thick file she had kept closed until now. The air was electric with anticipation. When she finally opened the folder and stood, the room fell completely silent. "This," she announced, holding up the document, "is a policy proposal that will take effect immediately in this courthouse and everyone under this district's jurisdiction." She called it the Monroe Mandate, named not after herself, but after her mother's family, a lineage of black women who endured with grace and strength. It will enforce psychological evaluations, anti-bias training, and a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior among all courthouse personnel. Heads lifted, eyes widened, reporters scribbled frantically, but Margaret wasn't finished. "I want to be clear, this is not about revenge. It's about responsibility," she said, her voice unwavering. "This mandate ensures that what happened to me, what happened to the countless names on this list, will never happen again. And if it does, it will not be buried in bureaucracy." The people in the gallery didn't clap. They didn't cheer. They stood quietly, reverently. Even those who had once averted their gaze now rose in shared recognition. Margaret looked out at them, her voice softer now, but just as fierce. "To the officials who enabled this abuse, who signed off on the silencing, who mistook this robe for blindness, I suggest you get ready. Because justice isn't just a principle in this courtroom anymore. It's a mandate." And with that, she lowered the folder and tapped her gavel once. It wasn't just court that was now in session. It was history. As the storm outside reached a furious crescendo, Judge Margaret Ellison sat tall behind the bench, the weight of the courtroom pressing inward. All eyes turned as the side door creaked open and Frank Dillard, no longer in uniform, no longer shielded by his badge, was escorted in wearing cuffs. His face was hollow, drained of the smugness he once wore like armor. Margaret's eyes met his, not with vengeance, but with the unflinching gravity of justice. The silence in the room was heavy as stone as she delivered the sentence. "Mr. Dillard," she began, her voice firm even, "you are hereby sentenced to 6 years in federal prison for abuse of power, 5 years for civil rights violations, and an additional year for obstruction of justice. These sentences will run consecutively." A murmur swept through the courtroom, but no one applauded. No one cheered. Because this wasn't a victory, it was a reckoning. Margaret leaned forward slightly, her eyes locked on the man who had once dragged her into that windowless room. "But that's just the legal part," she said. "Here's the human part. You spent your career deciding who was worthy of dignity and who wasn't. You used your uniform as a weapon. You thought no one would ever hold you accountable." Dillard looked down. He couldn't meet her gaze. "Well, now," she continued, "you get to sit in the seat you forced others into. No badge, no shield, just the weight of what you've done." With a nod, she signaled the officers to take him away. The click of the handcuffs echoed like punctuation on a long-buried sentence. As Dillard was led past the rows of people he had once looked down on, no one spoke. They didn't need to, because sometimes the greatest power doesn't come from punishment, it comes from finally being seen and heard. Judge Ellison looked down at the Monroe Mandate resting beside her and whispered, "Court is adjourned." But the impact, that was just beginning. Months passed, and though the headlines had quieted, the impact of what happened in that Charleston courtroom rippled far beyond its marble walls. Judge Margaret Ellison continued her work not behind fanfare, but with quiet resilience. The Monroe Mandate spread across districts adopted by other courts, inspired by her courage. In classrooms, law students studied the case not just as legal precedent, but as a turning point for institutional accountability. One day, Margaret stood in front of a group of young girls at a middle school. One of them, barely louder than a whisper, asked, "Do you still believe in the system?" Margaret paused, then said softly, "I don't believe in what the system was, but I believe in what it can become." That was the truth she had earned, through humiliation, through fire, through every step she took back to that bench with her head held high. And so the greatest lesson isn't that power lies in a robe or a gavel. It's that dignity, when defended, can change everything. When we speak out, when we stand tall after being knocked down, we remind the world that silence may protect the guilty, but courage protects us all. Have you ever witnessed injustice and stayed silent or spoken out? Share your experience in the comments below. Your voice matters, and if Margaret Ellison's story moved you, if it reminded you that change is possible even when the system seems immovable, subscribe to our channel. We tell stories that don't just expose injustice, we tell the ones that rewrite history. Because justice doesn't begin in the courtroom, it begins with us.